Hello everyone, my name's Daniel Avitan. I'm a pastor at Church of the Messiah, here with Victor Dehokubwayu. Victor has been going to Church of the Messiah for longer than me.
20 years, give or take.
Wow, 20 years.
Yeah. Actually 21, yeah.
Really, I had no idea it was that long.
Yeah.
But we're here to have a conversation about ethnicity and race and what it means to be made in the image of God. So given all of the recent unrest and the riots and the protests, we thought it would be great to have a conversation about it, to hear your perspective. And that's kind of what we're about, what we're about to do. So before we get into a bit of a discussion, can you give us a bit of a background of your life, where you grew up, where you're born, where you grew up, how you came to Canada?
Oh, how much time do you have?
Well, apparently only 30 minutes, but no, as long as you need.
So I was born in Rwanda, and in a Christian family. My dad was a minister, actually a bishop, and so it's dad, mom, 2 brothers and 1 sister. Dad passed away like 11 years ago. Mom is here, 2 brothers are here, and a sister in Europe. And I'm the youngest.
You're the youngest?
Yeah.
What was your childhood like? What were some of your hobbies when you were a kid? What did you enjoy doing? What was life like in Rwanda?
It's it was actually idyllic. Now that I think about it, it was quite idyllic. So I would say that the first 10 years of my life were perhaps the happiest, because it was in the countryside, and it was a mission hospital, a mission village. And so there was a school, actually primary, secondary school, a hospital, a bank, even some electricity, running water. So it was nice.
Yeah.
And it was quite near Lake Kivu. So it was, very beautiful and very pristine. And so then when I turned 10, my family moved to Kigali, the capital city, and lived there till pretty much 94, when the war broke out in Rwanda. And I went to a high school, a boarding school, all-boy boarding school, and that also was a very happy time of my life, just being with the boys, and a lot of memories.
That's terrific.
But very formative years.
Sure.
Yeah.
You mentioned you're there up until the war. As much as you're comfortable with, is there anything you'd like to share about your experience going through the conflict and obviously the genocide?
Yeah, I mean, where you see, most people, when they see a Rwandan, they just put that person in a box. They say he's either a victim or he's a perpetrator. And they just tend to put race on each one of the epithet. So they say, well, if you are X race,
right,
then you must be a victim, and if you are Y race, you must be the perpetrator. So, and growing up in my country, actually, ethnicity was not something that was talked about that often, at least in the years that I was growing up. It's very strange, really, because growing up, I didn't know whether I was a Hutu or a Tutsi, because those were not things that parents talked about. Some people did, but most people didn't. Or if they did, it was just in a passing reference, really. At least in my environment it was. And it remained that way until 1990 when trouble started. And so that's when for the first time, I became acutely aware of ethnicity, because back then it just didn't register before. Right. And then I remember just going back home, asking my parents the ethnic group to which I belong, because I really didn't know. Wow. And so even now, I cannot pinpoint with certainty and tell you of this ethnic group, because there have been so many intermarriages and there have been so many people just changing tribes depending on political affiliations and all those things. So, and so it came as a surprise to me when we got to 1994. Of course, people had been talking about war happening and just using mass media to kind of polarize groups. And so I knew something might happen because you kind of feel it in the air, but I really didn't predict the intensity of what went on. And let me just say this. In the part of the city we were living, I think we were maybe, let's say, in that part of the city, we were maybe 5, 6, 7,000 people. By the end of the week, you couldn't count 100 people alive. So it was just, that just gives you the idea of how death became so prevalent than life. So it was just, it's indescribable. You just cannot, even now it's been 25, almost 26 years that those things, actually 26 years that those things have happened. And I still cannot find the exact lexicon to describe, you know, the atrocity, the sheer evil and the senselessness of it all. And then, of course, I come back to all those questions of ethnicity, because I've been blessed to be in this country, so I'm away geographically and chronologically. I'm just a bit removed from those events. And so I suppose I've been blessed to just think about it and reflect about it. And so the more I think about it, the more I think there is always a spiritual element to it, actually a lot of spiritual element to it, because you just, I cannot explain how a person, a good friend of yours, one day would be your friend, because I had some buddies. We were playing volleyball on a Monday, and on a Friday they were just pointing their spears and swords by my neck and saying, you know, we're going to kill you. So it was just that transformation that you just say, you know, sometimes you would even say, hey buddy, it's me. Hey, right. Look at me. It's just, but anyway, so it is, and I think it has turned into, I mean, most people say that there was a power struggle, and that some of the people who wanted to take power and the other to just retain power used ethnicity as an instrument. Right. There was a lot of instrumentalization of ethnicity as just, you know, an identity problem, and using it as a weapon rather than something else.
Right, and there's this aspect as well of dehumanizing in order to almost justify that kind of violence. Can you speak to any of the dehumanization? I mean, we've seen it throughout, from the Holocaust to obviously the genocide in Rwanda. How did you see that dehumanization?
Gee, that's a difficult question. I don't know how to explain it, but I think where you see it starts in small steps. You know, it's never quantic leap. It's just always incremental, small steps, steps. And it just started by creating some sort of suspicion towards the otherness of other people. And then once they created that level of suspicion and distance, they, the powers that be on both sides, most of the time, so they just used that distance or that differentiation as a tool to instill hatred. Right. And then once they instilled, hatred and suspicion, they started to say, well, look, the other person is your enemy, and killing your enemy is actually defending yourself. Right. And before you knew it, a lot of people were saying, don't worry, God created us superior, the others are inferior, and we are entitled to just kill them. And it happened on both sides. It's not something that you would say that it happened just on one side of the equation. It happened on both sides, because the numbers that we have now tend to suggest that at least between 1990 and say 2000, 2.5 million people had died, and of the 2.5 million people, you would say that maybe 500,000, 600,000 were of the minority group, and the rest were the majority group. So you can see that there is a lot of blame too.
Absolutely. I mean, in preparation for this, you and I talked about this idea of the Imago Dei, people being created in the image of God. So, we talk about a bit of the dehumanization aspect that, like you mentioned, incrementally builds and kind of snowballs until there's conflict leading to killings, leading to an entire genocide. Do you want to speak to this idea of the Imago Dei, how it has come to shape your thinking?
Oh, yeah, of course. Yeah, and I was actually listening to a podcast by a good friend of ours. She's also from Rwanda. And so she was saying that the U.S. motto, just out of many, one, it's not a good motto, that actually the Christian motto should be out of one, many, to just say that we all come from one creator, and that he has given us different and diverse identities, but each one of them reflecting his image, and that we should respect the other person, not because he looks exactly like us, but because he's created in the image of God. Right. To just respect that imprint of God's Spirit that he has put in each one of us, so that when you are looking at another person, you actually see God in him. And so, and of course, that's easier said than done, but there are small things that actually have helped me. Things such as not to look at a person as a cause or as belonging to a particular bucket,
Right.
but actually to look at a person as someone, as a human being in his or her own right.
Right.
And it's very difficult to do because you really have to pierce or lift a lot of veils to actually, be given the grace to see the person as they truly are.
Right.
And here is an example, really. I was in South Africa. I mean, my parents were living in South Africa at the time. And so it was just after apartheid and Mandela was in power and everything was really wonderful. But even there and then, I could see that that country has known so much struggle, so much hatred, that every single difference was a source of conflict. So there were conflicts between men and women, black and white, educated and uneducated,
Right.
black South Africans and other Africans from other continents. It was just black and white. See, educated and uneducated. It was just every single distinguishing feature was a source of conflict. And then you say, oh, why is that? Maybe it's because some people, strangely enough, think that diversity, having diverse people, diverse identities, is something to shun, or it's not part of the design of what the universe is supposed to be, when that's precisely the whole point.
That's right.
Because I wouldn't want to be, in a place where everyone looks like me. It would be, really boring. But anyway.
Yeah, that's a really good point. That there is this big push almost to iron out all differences, as if difference is the source of the problem. When we think of the gospel, there is this level ground at the foot of the cross, precisely because what you mentioned, that we are made in God's image.
Yeah.
So we have inherent value. Christ dies on our behalf, whether black or white, male or female, rich or poor, all of that stuff.
But you see, I wanted to come back to another point. I actually almost forgot about it. So I started thinking about, all those questions about identity and how come that some people just cling to identity as a weapon. And I noticed that maybe the source may be disordered love, that they put identity above everything else. So it's some sort of idolatry where you just say,
Right.
well, first and foremost, I belong to this, and this is what makes me who I am. Because identity is just, whatever is permanent and from which you derive some sense of worth.
Right.
So where you just would say, well, I am, say, black or white or this, and my being black gives me the intrinsic worth. When actually, that's not the case. It's the whole issue of just saying, oh, I'm created in the image of God, and all matters, or everything that gives me worth, value, is just the love of God, and everything that's permanent it's just Jesus, because you know everything here is it's wind, it will pass away. And so when you start thinking about where you should actually direct your love or things that you should worship, that's when all those barriers start, you know, coming down, because then you know that you shouldn't be threatened by people maybe attacking your temporal identity, because you know you have an eternal identity
Right.
and eternal worth. And I think that's a message that should be conveyed broadly.
Yeah.
And but also the other thing that people may want to think about is, yes, I'm aware of all these protests going on here in Canada and in the US, but I would like to see concrete steps and small steps too. You know, it doesn't have to be big. You know, things such as welcoming people in our homes, showing them who we are. I mean, like the family that received me here in Canada did, because it was just, they took a huge risk.
And you came here as a refugee?
I came here as a refugee, and so that family sponsored me. So they took a huge risk, and I remember the first day I was there, and a very loving family. So the head of the household was kind of dour at the time. I just saw him as intimidating. So I get there, I'm jet lagged, and remember in Africa it was summer. I got here, it was winter, January. So it was just, everything was just a blur. So,
Huge shock to the system.
exactly.
Yeah.
So I'm there, and so he sits me down at the dining table, and he says, "Well, Victor, I know you've come here, you've got some aspirations, and you've got some ideas of how you will live here. So you really have two choices. I will boil it down. You really have two choices. You can either live as an African here in Canada, or you could live as a Canadian in Canada. And I've made the choice for you. You're going to live as a Canadian in Canada. So whatever I teach my kids, I will teach you. Whatever I give them, I will give you."
Wow.
And so you see, they opened up to me, and they allowed themselves to be vulnerable.
Right.
You know, to show me their weaknesses, their strength. And I think it was, you know, one of the most precious gifts that I've received when I arrived here. It was just to be given the privilege to belong.
Wow. Yeah, that's really good. You mentioned about this idea of disordered desires. It'd be good to maybe unpack that a bit. You know, you mentioned this idea of putting our ultimate hope in, you said temporal things rather than eternal things. Is it bad to have an affinity for one's identity, one's situation, one's ethnicity, all of that? That it's not necessarily inherently bad. What's the proper place for some of that?
Well, you see, that's a very complex question, and for those who are really, really interested in that subject, Miroslav Volf wrote a book called Exclusion and Embrace. He really discusses all those issues, you know, how, of course, you know, he talks about how an identity is formed and how you just cannot allow inclusion to be symbiosis, where you just say that the person loses their identity.
Right.
So the issue is not that you shouldn't have an identity, you shouldn't have some affinity to temporal identity. Like, I like Rwandan poetry, I like Rwandan songs.
Totally.
They speak to me. That's my mother tongue, that's my culture.
Absolutely.
And I wouldn't be just saying, I wouldn't be true to myself if I just gave it up. But you add on. You add on that identity because, again, even when we talk about disordered love, or as C.S. Lewis just would say, our Augustine, it isn't that, it's taking a good thing to make it into an ultimate thing. Right. And so identity in and of itself is good. Right. Temporal identity is good, but it's not the ultimate good. And when we talk about, disordered love, it's just taking identity as an idol, putting it above everything else. I mean, temporal identity, when actually all you should put above everything else, all you should worship is God. And that's where you would get your identity. But anyway, it's an entirely complex subject. It will be just worth another discussion.
Sure.
But for those who are interested, I mean, Miroslav Volf just discusses that issue beautifully.
Yeah. You mentioned about worship. I think as humans, we cannot not worship. So if we're not worshiping God, we're worshiping something else. And I think that's an excellent point that you made.
Well, you and I have heard of This Is Water, David Foster Wallace.
Right.
Yeah, where we just said, it's everyone worships, and
right.
And that the problem with worshiping the wrong thing is that they will eat you alive. You worship identity, ethnic identity or nationalistic identity, it eats you alive. Like in my case, I mean, I'm not back in Rwanda, I'm here. So try to imagine if I had taken, my national identity as the ultimate thing, it would have destroyed me.
Yeah, that's excellent insight, absolutely. So Victor, we've had a few questions emailed in from our congregation. Would love for you to speak to some of this. So all the questions actually were given to me anonymously. Okay. So we have one of the questions is this. Systemic racism is a term and phrase that has been everywhere in the last few months. Could you speak to that? Could you define it as best as you understand it, what it is, what you perceive the source of this to be? Is it a compilation of things? Could you just speak to this idea of systemic racism?
I do not like big terms, especially if they are not defined. And so far I haven't heard any good pithy definition of systemic racism. Mm-hmm. And I would prefer the word exclusion because there are some exclusionary practices that you see in every society, and every society, as we know, has its own idols, and every society has its own exclusions or select societies. And and perhaps the way I would put it, I mean, we cannot talk about systemic exclusion or systemic racism without touching on the issue of justice. So, and most people have defined justice as that which gives to each person what is their right due, or what they deserve or their entitlement. So, and of course, in this society, we seem to confer that to the state, that it's actually the state that should confer on individual rights, when, as a matter of fact, as we discussed a moment ago, I think it is actually God that confers on us our human rights by virtue of being created in his image, and that the state should safeguard our innate rights, not actually be the provider of rights, but the protector of the rights that we have. Now, but that being said, I mean, we live in a fallen world, fallen societies. Most of the time, the states confer, they are the ones who actually give the rights to individuals. And so when states give rights to individuals, the question becomes, is the distribution equitable, fair? And and I think we discussed some time ago about Aristotle, how he saw it, where he just said he saw justice as, what he called distributive justice, as some sort of maybe a mathematical equation, where he said A divided by B equals C divided by D, and to make sure that you always keep that in the right proportions.
Right.
So that you would say that if you take A times D equals B times D. So, and, but anyway, it was just doing all those, no, it was A divided by B equals C divided by D, which would mean that B would correspond to C and D would correspond to A. And where he just said, you really have to make sure that if you take all those things, you come up with fair and equal distribution. Right. Now, but most of the time, what happens is it doesn't seem to be equal. Sometimes you have a measure which disproportionately affects one group than the other. And it could be any measure. It could be distribution of land, it could be distribution of wealth, it could be even how you determine meritocracy, where you just set terms and then, you could say maybe meritocracy, if you went to an Ivy League, then, or if you did this, or if you just scored this high, then you're entitled to this. Now, what if all those criteria tend to disproportionately affect one group over the other? What do you do? So as a state, aren't you supposed to bring a corrective to your distribution of rights? And I think systemic exclusion happens when you've done that distribution of rights, and then after all is said and done, you see disparities, and you're not willing to actually bring a corrective so that the people who are disproportionately affected get their right share to whatever the state is distributing. Now, in Canada, you will see those things. For example, I know that some people, some friends of mine, complained about meritocracy in some institutions, where they just said, well, look, most of the time, in order to be, a member of the board, you will be asked questions such as, do you have connections? Do you have strategic vision? Now, in order to have connections, you actually, most of the time, you need to have been born here, gone to the right schools, hang around the right kind of people. And because those people become your network, and actually those people would guide you towards strategic visions, because they would be the one who know what's happening and who can tell you how to strategically position yourself to actually be able to advise on any particular issue. Now, what do you do when you see that you've set those criteria as merit criteria and you see that they are disproportionately affecting people?
Right.
And do you actually change those criteria, or do you make sure that the people who are disproportionately affected get to acquire, help them, give them a helping hand to acquire all those merit criteria? And that's a huge question.
That's huge.
And that's why I started with perhaps opening our homes and giving a person a chance. Like in my case, that family gave me a chance because all of a sudden, their connections became my connections.
Right.
And what they knew, they told me. So it gave me some, I suppose, leg up. Mm-hmm. And in looking back, I kind of say, perhaps that's what systemic racism or systemic exclusion may look like.
Right.
It would be just those instances where the state has distributed rights and the distribution method has disproportionately affected one group. Could be blacks, could be Indian, could be Jews, could be anyone.
Right.
So, and the state just, after noticing that there are disparities in the results, just refused to make any changes. And I would say it becomes subtle. I know I've just given you a long-winded answer,
No,
but it's just because it's so subtle and the stakes are huge.
Right.
Because most people don't want to bring a corrective, because by bringing a corrective, you're conferring entitlements on a group and you are empowering, emboldening them.
Sure.
And perhaps the problem also, coming back to that issue of identity becomes, if I empower other people, does it mean that I decrease so that they may increase?
Yeah,
so,
exactly.
So it just becomes maybe a matter of, once again, disordered love, where you just say, what if you decrease a little? Is your identity tied to your temporal entitlements? So it's just all that issue, and that's why I think that slogans are not the right way to go about this, because slogans do not produce results.
So the bit about the systemic exclusion as opposed to systemic racism, I mean, what I'm hearing you say is that there's more at play than just one's ethnicity that is the source of exclusion.
Yeah.
It is whether they're new Canadian or fourth or fifth generation Canadian, whether they come from some kind of money or not, whether, I mean, it's almost a holistic understanding of looking at disparity as opposed to seeing it as simply just race or ethnically based.
Yeah, or it could be a white kid who's never had chances that other white kids have had access to.
That's right.
So, and but also it's, I don't know how I would put this, but I don't want people to fall into maybe stupid mistakes. I know my son wouldn't want me to use the word stupid. He would say it's dirty. Why are you using it? But really, okay. And by this I mean, most people think that someone who comes from a disadvantaged group cannot be a jerk. And sometimes it could, they can be so obnoxious that sometimes you would say, I would wonder how that person could be included if he's not willing to make the effort to be accepted in good society. And so, and sometimes you will see a lot of people, especially from privileged classes, behaving so obsequiously, obsequious towards the disadvantaged people and kind of overlook things that the disadvantaged people could work on to be accepted in the participation of civil society, where it just becomes condescending, almost paternalistic, where you just say, if you see someone actually going astray and you do not correct them for fear of actually just saying, oh no, I don't want to exert my privilege over them, it's
not loving.
Is that actually loving?
Right. Which this actually kind of dovetails into another question. We had somebody ask a question along the lines of wanting to respect and connect with and have conversations with people of color. This person's Caucasian, but they're afraid of precisely this, coming across as condescending. So they feel almost crippled with how to interact with their neighbors that are people of color or Muslim or whatever, because obviously everything's extremely charged, racially charged, and it's through the lens of are you a bigot? Yes, you are. All this implicit behavior that people are aware of, or maybe they're not aware of. So could you speak, give some advice for this person in our congregation?
I was laughing because my wife, we were chatting the other time, and she told me that she had some of the people come to her telling her how some people behaved in a racist way towards them. And my wife was saying, well, I'm not seeing it though. I'm not just seeing it. And they were saying, no, you've just become white. You've been living here for too long and you've lost your edge. You're not sensitive to those issues. Well, as a matter of fact, I guess it's maybe, I guess the point I wanted to convey here is people shouldn't behave funny towards people who don't look like them. Seriously, and because, when you think about the other person being created in the image of God,
right.
You see that person as your equal. You see that person as a person where you just say, I'm not speaking to a black person. I'm speaking to a human being.
Right.
So, case in point, okay? If you came to me, say, you tell me, you see me the first time, you notice I'm black, and you say, you come to me and you talk to me about Black Lives Matter, I would say, first of all, you don't know me, and you don't even know what I may think about this, or even if I know about this. Why can't you have a normal conversation with me and say, hey, beautiful weather,
Yeah.
like you would with someone else. Because, the fact that we are created in the image of God also makes the other person expect a certain modicum of respect, dignity, and civility when dealing with the other person, and actually granting the other person the benefit of the doubt. Saying they mean well. If a person is making the effort to come to you, everywhere you go, in every society, people would see it as a friendly gesture. And so I would say the question is not how to address someone of a different ethnic background. The question is, how do you address your neighbor?
Right.
Could be Muslim, could be black, could be white, could be anything. Could be straight, could be gay. I mean, how do you talk to your neighbor? So for them, for the friends who ask those questions, I would say just act normal.
Right.
Just talk to them like you would talk to anyone else. Talk to me like you would talk to your brother, to your sister, and try to know me. Just
Yeah. No, I think that's excellent advice. As a church, we're far from perfect. I mean, what has marked the church apart from Christ is its imperfection. Could you speak to, not necessarily our church, if you'd like to give examples by all means, but from your perspective, how the church can go about leading the charge or maybe addressing some of these issues that we've talked about, within, I guess, this idea of the dignity of all people. How can the church, I guess, up its game, or is the church doing a good job? It's a bit of a broad question, but I'll let you speak to it however you want to.
I think, nothing is perfect, but, the fact that the church has accepted me just shows that it's not that exclusionary, So it's doing fine. But is there room for improvement? Yeah, I would say, sure, yeah. Of course, there always is room for improvement. Yeah. And one of them is just dialogue.
Yeah.
Because like what we are doing here is, I would think it's huge, but also given the stakes and given the subtlety of the whole issue, there is a need for good fora or forums where people could meet and discuss difficult issues in a trusting environment.
Right.
Where, as my wife was telling the other person, well, look, that's not racism, it's just because you didn't get it right. And to have actually a person believe the other one that what they're saying is not coming from a place of insecurity or anything, but it's just coming from a good place, from a trusting place, that you're actually trying to do right by your neighbor. And I think that would go a long way to actually make an effort to create occasions, fora where people could just say, we know this is an issue, let's talk about it candidly, because the fact that I'm black and perhaps from a disadvantaged group, first of all, it doesn't mean that I'm that disadvantaged, because if I look myself in the mirror, I wouldn't say that I'm disadvantaged. So, or that I'm evil or anything, but where we just could sit down, have candid discussions, where actually one is not threatened to lose his status, where we just could say, well, look, when you say, I know this sounds like kindergarten, but where someone could say, well, look, when you actually behave that way, it does have a certain connotation. Maybe you shouldn't do it. Or where someone else could say, well, you know what? Me think thou protest too much. Where they would just say, well, look, it's just the way it is here. And to actually have that relationship of trust where someone could actually know that what the other person says actually means it and means it well.
A lot of these themes we've kind of circled around, and I think it's excellent. This idea of opening your home. It's exactly what you're saying. Having people at your table, having conversations without pushing necessarily an agenda. Seeing people made in the image of God. All these things can't be done over Twitter. They have to be face to face. They have to be without a very hard time constraint. And ultimately, there has to be a level of humility in all of this. Hey?
A level of humility and patience.
It's a big one, patience, eh?
Patience. I mean, humility in that we are actually willing to listen and, willing to listen and understand the otherness of other people. That they are not, and that the fact that they are not like us is not a source of conflict.
Right.
It's actually complementary. It's like you go to a place, you travel to a place, and you bring back something and you put it on a wall. It adds something to the house, to your home. It adds something to your identity. It actually enriches your identity. It enriches the tapestry of human existence. And I think it is those things that we should be thinking about. That's on humility and on patience. We cannot expect that a problem that was created over generations is going to be resolved overnight. It's just, you really have to be committed to it, and small steps, and one by one, just from the inside out, where you just try to make the best out of a not so perfect situation, but where you have to be actually intentional, and where you have to have concrete goals. And I would say maybe the concrete goals of this conversation is to say, let's open up dialogue.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that was an excellent insight. Not just humility, but patience. We're coming to the end of our conversation. Is there any kind of last parting words you'd like to share with us? Kind of leave it open for you.
Maybe in closing, thinking of what's going on here, I would say people should start thinking of people and seeing people as human beings, not as causes to exploit, not as a means to an end, but as an end in and of themselves.
Yeah, that's really good. Excellent. Thank you so much for your time. It's a real pleasure.
Thank you.